Joining us now from London, UK, Richard Wilkinson, co-author of The Spirit Level, Why More Equal Societies Almost Always Do Better. And Richard Wilkinson, as I welcome you to the program over on this side of the pond, I want to just read a quote from your book, which opens with a rather grim depiction of modern life. Here's the quote. "It is a remarkable paradox that at the pinnacle of human material and technical achievement, we find ourselves anxiety-ridden, prone to depression, worried about how others see us, unsure of our friendships, driven to consume, and with little or no community life." The thesis behind your book is that things are the way they are because of inequality. And I want to know why, first of all, you believe inequality is the main culprit for that list of things we just read.
Well, I'd been working for a long time on differences in health between different rich developed countries and also differences in health between rich and poor within countries. And I found that more equal societies, that's societies with smaller income differences between rich and poor, had better average health in terms of life expectancy. But we gradually realized that wasn't simply a pattern that occurred with health or even just physical health. It also occurs with mental health. It occurs with a huge range of social problems, so violence, drug abuse, the size of prison populations, teenage births, child well-being. All sorts of these problems are not just a little bit more common, but much more common in more unequal societies. As I say, we're just looking at the rich developed countries, but we also looked at the 50 American states, asking the same question, whether the more equal American states did better in terms of the scale of all these health and social problems. And the picture is very similar. We
have some charts here, actually, that we're going to share with our viewers that suggest that which you have just referenced. Teenage births, imprisonment, and mental illness. Michael, let's bring these up and we'll go through them. Here's teenage births. And if you look in the lower left-hand part of the screen, you see countries such as Japan, Sweden, Denmark, Finland, Norway, where income inequality is less significant. There's Canada in the middle. And then, of course, in the top right, where there is high income inequality, you've got the United States of America, where there are more teenage births. Let's go to imprisonment. Same kind of story. If you look at the numbers there, prisoners per 100,000 population, you see that same cluster of countries in the low end of things. And there's the USA and Singapore up into the top end of the chart. And one more, you mentioned...
What's important to...
Well, stand by, I'm going to do one more, Richard. I'm going to do one more, and that is that mental illness as well. Where we see, once again, the same kind of results, Japan, Belgium, Germany, in the lower part, because there's less income inequality there, according to your studies, Australia, UK, USA, up at the high end. Okay, you wanted to say what's important is what?
The scale of the differences between the more and less equal countries. I mean, differences in mental illness. Mental illness is 3 times as common in countries like the USA, the more unequal ones, compared to some of the more equal in our data. Imprisonment, 8 or 10 times the proportion of the population in prison in the more unequal societies. We're dealing with really huge differences, and we find there's a very clear pattern that it's always the same countries that do badly on all these things and the same ones that do well. So what we're looking at is a sort of tendency to a general social dysfunction in more unequal societies. It's not just 1 or 2 things that go wrong, it's most things.
I'm going to add a couple of more to the list here. We looked at trust and social mobility. And again, Michael, let's bring up the trust graphic first of all. You asked the question, most people in this society can be trusted. Who would agree with that? And apparently if you live in Sweden or Norway or Denmark, Finland, Japan, Canada's not doing badly on that one either. They believe most people can be trusted. It's a sign you say of a healthier society. The Americans, the Portuguese, Singapore, not so good. A high level of mistrust in those societies. The conventional wisdom is the United States is a society where people can climb up the economic ladder. But your chart suggests it's not the case. How come?
Well, I think that more unequal societies, there's more status competition, probably more status insecurity, but more downward prejudices, snobbishness, class prejudices, prejudice against ethnic minorities. That pattern of the sort of prejudice against people lower down in the hierarchy, I think, is increased. And it's, you know, whether you think of the social ladder as being steeper in more unequal societies or the rungs on the ladder further apart, it becomes harder to get up and down. Although in that particular graph on social mobility, we have rather few countries, more recent data provides a few more countries that fit in very well with that. And we know also that while income differences widened in Britain and the United States, social mobility slowed in both countries. So I think that despite the rather small number of countries, we have to take that relationship seriously.
Let's bring up the social mobility graph. While you have just mentioned it, once again, there's that same cluster of countries, Norway, Denmark, Sweden, Finland, Canada doing not badly, and again, the UK and the USA, where there is high income inequality, not much social mobility. The conventional wisdom, again, is that the call for equality was seen as serving the interests of lower income people. What is your view on what less income inequality might do for rich people in society?
Well, it looks to us as if the benefits of greater equality are biggest amongst the least well-off, lower down the social ladder, but they extend all the way up to the top. So even the better off benefit a little bit from greater equality. So even well-educated, well-paid, middle-class people will be likely to live a little bit longer in a more equal society. They'll be less likely to be victims of violence. Their children will do a little bit better at school, in that maths and literacy scores in different countries seem to be better in more equal societies. And kids will be less likely to get involved in drugs or become teenage parents if you live in a more equal society. So in a sense, it looks as if greater equality improves the quality of life for the vast majority of the population.
Let me do one more question with you, Richard Wilkinson, before I bring the others in to join the discussion here. And apropos of your most fascinating election that you had yesterday in the UK, I want to bring up the Equality Pledge here, because 430 candidates who ran in yesterday's election actually signed this pledge, including 20 Conservatives. And let me read it. They signed on to the following: I am committed to making the UK a more equal society as the most effective means of building a better society. I will therefore actively support the case for policies designed to narrow the gap between rich and poor and engage with the debate on which measures should be implemented to achieve that aim. Now, you called on all parties to sign on to that. They did, not as many Conservatives obviously as the others, but it is a nonpartisan issue as you've put it forward. My question though is this not more really the cause of the left than of anybody else?
Well, traditionally that's probably true, but in our recent election, all the political parties agreed that inequality was too great in Britain and should be reduced. Were almost as unequal as the United States, more unequal than Canada, were twice as unequal as countries like Finland, Japan, Sweden, Norway, the more equal of the developed countries. And interestingly, the leader of the Conservative Party, David Cameron, mentioned our book in a major speech of his and acknowledged that inequality is damaging to a society. And in a way, I think that's part of the common intuition that people have had for centuries, that inequality is divisive and socially corrosive. And in a way, that's all the data shows.
Okay, Richard, thank you for setting the table for the discussion forgive me, thank you for setting the table for the discussion that is to come here. And I want to introduce the rest of our guests who are going to join you now and have a discussion about that which you have put forward. And they are: in Tucson, Arizona, Layne Kenworthy. He's a professor of sociology and political science at the University of Arizona. In Montreal, Quebec, William Watson, economics professor at McGill University. Here in studio, Bob Rae, Liberal Member of Parliament for Toronto Centre, and Sylvia Bashevkin, professor of political science at the University of Toronto. It's good to have everybody both here in the studio and in Points Beyond on our program tonight. Bob Rae, to you first. Issue at hand is the disparity of incomes between the rich and the poor. How relevant a benchmark do you think that is?
I think it's tremendously important. I mean, I think if we think of life in Canada, we can take the most dramatic differences between Aboriginal people, First Nations living on reserve, and look at the tremendous differences in opportunity, differences in outcome, differences in health, differences in every prospect of life. And I think it really is a question for Canadians as to, You know, are we all citizens of the same country or not? How do we create a climate of solidarity in which people have opportunity? I don't think, I mean, in the old days, this debate was a kind of a socialism versus capitalism discussion. I think that debate's over. I think we all recognize that competitive economies are here to stay. I think the real question is, what kind of modern economy do we want to have, and what kind of society do we want to have together? And I think the value that's been underestimated for a long time in our political discussions is what I call the value of solidarity, the value of the things that we share together as a society, and the obligations we have to one another, and how we make things better for people. And I think what's been presented in Professor Wilkinson's study, which is having an impact not just in the academy, but I think it needs to have an impact in politics, is to say, look, these are, he used the word corrosive, these are corrosive things that we can see, and we don't have to go very far to understand how difficult life in inner cities can be, how difficult the gap is between people living in rural communities where there's a great deal of poverty and challenges, and people living in richer places. And it's not a matter of pulling people down, or, you know, of all the arguments that used to be used about, well, why can't we do all this? Why should we be concerned about this? I think it really is a question now of how do we make citizenship meaning for people, and being part of the same society is meaningful. The social determinants of health argument has been there for a long time, but I think what we're beginning to see is a discussion that takes us beyond that, to recognize that this takes us into just about every aspect of our social lives together, and it's a discussion and a debate that we really need to have in Canada as much as in other countries.
We're going to make our modest contribution to it right now. Now, just remind me, did your daughter have a class with a certain member of the august group that we have on here today? He's smiling already, so I think, Bill Watson, do you remember Bob Ray's daughter as one of your students?
I do, and had I wanted to encourage social mobility, I would have given her lower marks than her father. Well, she was a very good student. She got very high marks.
She got high marks, all right.
I couldn't do anything about it. I helped perpetuate the existing structure.
Well, all right, so you've heard the call here, Bill Watson, for that a more egalitarian society is a better, a happier society with fewer problems. What say you to that thesis?
Look, I think the correlations are quite interesting, and they raise a lot of really complex questions. And I also think that poverty is a problem. When you have to sort of step across people in the Montreal subway who are living in the subway, that's clearly a problem. They should do something about it, but society needs to do something about it. Inequality is different, right? If we get the bottom group of people growing at 5% a year or 7% a year, that'd be great. Doesn't bother me if the top level are growing at 8 or 10%. I'm concerned with the sort of absolute ability of folks at the bottom to make themselves better off and to have access to opportunities. But the income distribution, the numbers that we see, they come out of all sorts of different individual and corporate decisions. You're an anchorman, you're not a cameraman. Well, how did that get to be? Was it a fundamentally unfair process that prevented this cameraman here from becoming an anchorman? These numbers move around for lots of reasons. There was a study in the Brookings Institution several years ago. Brookings Institution, sort of to the left of the spectrum, 40% of the increase in family inequality in the U.S. was a result of the fact that professional men tended to marry professional women, and working class men tended to marry working class women. That tends to exaggerate family inequality. I don't think that's a problem. I don't think we should have a marriage prevention act for professionals so that we encourage people to marry out of their class. So poverty is clearly a problem, but inequality, those numbers jump around for all sorts of reasons.
Let me get Layne Kenworthy to weigh in on this. What do you say?
Well, I want to call attention to two different ways of thinking about whether it's okay to have a lot of inequality. So the previous commentator was focusing very much on the fairness of the process by which we reach more or less unequal outcomes, whereas the spirit level book focuses very much on other social consequences. And these are the two ways that people typically have thought about whether inequality is bad or whether there's too much or too little. But they really are very different ways of assessing it. You could agree that for example, it's okay on fairness grounds for there to be even as much inequality as there is in the United States. There are a number of people who think that. And yet, if it's true that that much inequality causes crime to be worse or life expectancy to be shorter or more teenage births, then that might fundamentally change the argument.
Okay, let me go to Sylvia Beshevkin now. Sylvia, the call for equality is not new. 1789, French Revolution. They had a revolution in Russia about it. China. With all the existing disparities that exist today, are we not, in fact, a more egalitarian society, maybe the most we've been in a long, long time or ever?
Well, I think a lot of it depends, Steve, on how we're going to measure inequality, right? I mean, you can even go back to Aristotle's Ethics to find a discussion about equality, which was all about treating equals equally. So if we just talk about how we're treating people within categories, we know that we could imagine a supposedly equal society in which, in the case of ancient Greece, there was slavery, or women were not considered citizens, for example. And it's all about the within category equality questions. You're right, when we get into the Enlightenment period, it's much more about abolishing the sort of differences across nobility and clergy and commoners. And we're now speaking about an era in which we have legal equality, formal equality, quite widely distributed. But I think what the spirit level calls attention to are the enormous other inequalities which transcend formal legal rights, which we've all gained, and which in fact make it possible to see other sources of inequality that may in fact be far more egregious or far more consequential than we might have thought. In other words, it takes us beyond the formal legal definition. It takes us into the realm of examining countries, and it takes us into the realm, I think as Layne pointed out, to thinking about the consequences of inequality, even for those at the very highest. So it's not so much about individual X and individual Y, it's about the social cohesion that is lost in highly unequal societies. And so I think if we're talking about inequality measured by income and wealth and the ability to have, for example, a socially secure feeling about oneself in a mental health sense, then it's a much larger array of variables that permit us, I think, to see the degree to which there are still massive inequalities, even in a world where we believe that we've marched straight out of the Enlightenment and, in fact, created legal, formal equality for all of us.
Richard Wilkinson, I should give you a chance now to respond to any of that which you have just heard about your thesis.
Well, I should emphasize that we're not talking about any sort of perfect or idealistic complete equality. We're just looking at the differences between existing market democracies, rich market democracies, and different American states, for instance. But some of these patterns have been checked out. I mean, for instance, the relationship between homicide and inequality has been checked out probably 40 times, and the pattern of better health in more equal societies, there are now probably 200 papers on that relationship. So this is not a sort of idealistic study. It's simply a bit of analysis of the empirical evidence using data from the most reputable sources like the World Bank, the UN, the World Health Organization, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. So I think what we find, the basic relationships are almost indisputable. Perhaps there are questions of interpretation. There are certainly questions about how different countries end up with the amount of inequality they have. But I don't think there's any reason to think that most of our societies couldn't be as equal as Finland or Japan or Norway, for instance.
I have a question now for somebody with political antennae, and Bob Ray, you're sitting right over there, so you get this next one. Much of the equality, I think it's safe to say, over the last 50 years has been achieved because of economic growth. And we have here a program that we're talking about today that very much does not depend on economic growth to get us to the finish line. What do your political antennae tell you about the advisability of trying to sell that message?
Well, I think there's a tremendous appetite in all of our countries for a real debate. We've become almost paralyzed now by I would say a right-wing consensus that says, well, we can't talk about taxation, we can't talk about outcomes, we can't worry too much about the consequences that Dr. Kenworthy talked about. We've just got to talk about you know, the worry about process and so on. I think there's a huge concern in our society about how we're doing, what our prospects are together, and I think we have to figure out ways. Certainly, people from my political tradition have to be thinking about how can we really talk to people about the values, the advantages to people, advantages to our whole society of worrying about, of thinking about how we need to address deep poverty, which is very much present, and how much of that is best addressed by programs which reinforce, as I said, the citizenship that we share, that give it some real meaning and substance. And I think whether we look at healthcare, whether we look at pensions as an issue that I think is very much on people's minds in terms of their future security, whether we look at opportunities for immigrants, one of the questions that I would have for the academics in the group is, if you look at the Scandinavian examples, they're not anywhere near as open societies as we are in terms of immigration, in terms of ethnic and social diversity. To what extent is that a factor? How do we reinforce these values in countries like Canada, the United States, which are far more open and far more diverse, and which have a whole series of social challenges to deal with, which are really quite different from the challenges that many of the European countries have to cope with. I'm not saying that we don't share some important things, but there are some other differences that we need to talk through. But I can tell you, from my perspective, as long as we let the Karl Roves of the world and their domestic equivalents in all of our countries determine what the political agenda is and determine what can be discussed and what can't be discussed, we're not going to move. As long as we're fighting on that terrain, we'll never win. And I think it's very incumbent on people who are of progressive orientation to really start talking to people about this with a mixture of deep values about solidarity and, frankly, a degree of populism, which I think is going to be required to really talk to people about how we're doing and why we need to figure out a way to make sure people do better.
William Watson, you want to come in on that issue of economic growth not being a trigger for a more egalitarian society that this book puts forward?
Well, I don't know that it is. As I said, 5% growth at the bottom, 7% growth at the top, that doesn't bother me. We're getting the bottom to move up. I think that's what's important. There is this notion that we've had this right-wing agenda and we're now back in the Dickensian era. I just think that's a complete crock. There's a study that came out this week from David Green and at University of British Columbia, highly respected labor economist, leans left, and colleagues at Statistics Canada, who of course are neutral. And what it looks at is the impact of the tax and transfer system, the government basically, through the last 25 years. And it finds that the government became more and more progressive. Each census year, 1980, 1985, 1990, through the conservative years, the Mulroney Revolution in Canada, all the way through to 1995, and then somewhat less progressive in 2000. But in 2000, still more, quotes, progressive than in 1980, the Trudeau years. So, I just don't think that what we think we know, we actually do know. I don't think it's true. Now, during that time, there was an increase in pre-government inequality. The standard story in economics is, well, we had a big technological revolution, and there tended, as a result, to be a greater payoff to people with higher education. So we got a bigger education premium. More so in the United States than in Canada, because in Canada we were pumping out a bigger supply of people with education through that period. So, these events seem to me to be more or less benign. To the extent that there are people in deep poverty, whether they're living on reserves, although it's difficult for the federal government to do anything about that because there's a certain independence there, or whether they're living in the metro, I think that's clearly something that has to concern us. But inequality moving up and down in that way, in a supposedly right-wing era that has become more progressive through time. I apologize, that's only Canadian data, but it's probably of greater relevance to the audience here.
Well, let me try this with Layne Kenworthy. We're in the era of Barack Obama right now in your country. I ask you whether you think the U.S. is more open, given that, to this idea of more egalitarianism in your country.
Well, that certainly hasn't been one of the central issues that the new administration has pursued. They've had other things to try to attend to, although you could argue that the healthcare reform was part of a sort of broadly egalitarian push. That's the kind of thing that, although it may make for a less unequal society, it doesn't show up at all in income statistics of the sort that the spirit level focuses on. I'll just say, getting back to the question of whether economic growth, if it's quite rapid throughout the distribution, but a little faster at the top, whether that's a problem. Here in the United States, where I am, it's been a problem because that hasn't been the way it's played out in the last generation. Incomes at the top have really soared through the roof, but we've had pretty slow income growth in the middle and very little, if any, income growth for households at the bottom of the distribution. And I'll just contrast that because it's a really interesting contrast with the story in the United Kingdom since the late 1970s. When the Labour government came into power, although it suggested to the British people that it wanted to move the UK in, again, a sort of broadly egalitarian direction, it made it clear that it wasn't going to focus on income inequality or reducing income inequality as a goal per se. Instead, it was going to focus on improving incomes and opportunities at the bottom of the distribution. And there's a fair amount of evidence that it succeeded in precisely this goal. And I tend to think about this, at least in fairness terms, as a much better result, though I'm not sure if the implications of Richard Wilkinson's book suggest that it really ought to be the sort of thing that we're shooting for. I think the implication there is that you really do need to attend to income inequality per se and not just reducing poverty.
Richard, do you want to come in on that?
Yes, I think a very important point. First, I should say that many studies of the effects of inequality have controlled for not only poverty itself, but incomes throughout a society. But I think even more important than that is the fact that there are diminishing returns to economic growth. You know, in poorer countries, it's where people haven't got the basic necessities, it's really important to have more. But in the rich world, to have more and more of everything makes less and less difference. And if you look at the relationship between, say, life expectancy and economic growth, there are very rapid rises in life expectancy in the early stages of economic growth. But then you lose the relationship between life expectancy and economic growth. If you look at happiness, the same thing is true. Rapid rises in happiness in the early stages of growth, and then you lose the relationship. You can look at measures of well-being within our societies over long periods when perhaps national income per person doubles. And measures of well-being are absolutely unresponsive. We are the first generation to have got to the end of what economic growth can do for us. And it's now driven, I think, largely by consumerism, status competition, and things like that. You know, you can improve your well-being if you move up within society. But the evidence shows if the whole society moves up together, nobody gets any real benefit from it.
Sylvia Bashevkin, let me try this with you. I think it's fair to say that much of the egalitarian impulse the last half century or so has come from the feminist movement, civil rights movement, sexual minority movements, those kinds of things. Those movements are not the same as the push for economic equality. And I wonder whether you think a significant number of Canadians are open to the appeal to lower the income differentials in our society.
Well, Stephen, no, I think the impulse is still a common one. I think if you look at pro-equality women's movements, sexual orientation movements, trade union movements, anti-poverty movements, I mean, I think that they do share that common source from the French Revolution ideas of egalitarianism. I think.
Does that mean economic egalitarianism?
Well, I think it looks at the various sources of inequality in society and reads them as having perhaps different hierarchies of meaning for different individuals and different groups, but still sees inequality as fundamentally a difficulty in a liberal democracy. So whether we want to talk about what the academics call intersectionality, where you have people with multiple identities which disadvantage them one on top of the other, I think that is a significant problem. We've seen great discussion in recent years about disabilities. We've seen a tremendous discussion about the aging process and the extent to which, as Bob mentioned, pensions vary tremendously across society in terms of people's ability to depend on a reasonable standard of living in their retirement. So I think the social movements that do come out of the 1960s share that common impulse about human equality and the values of a cohesive society. I think to go back to the question of what happens when we're in societies like those in North America, which have had traditionally high levels of immigration, we've seen ourselves as immigrant societies. What happens if we sort of take immigration and impose it on older European cases? For example, the more egalitarian cases that we see in the spirit level, Sweden or Finland, for example. You can still see the research on those Nordic cases, which shows that social mobility is considerably better in those cases where you have immigration from South Asia and East Asia than what we have currently in the United States. In other words, the opportunities for immigrant children in egalitarian societies, albeit those which are somewhat older and not as focused on immigrant receiving as North American societies have been, still the opportunities for those individuals tend to be better right now in a place like Sweden than in the US. And that, I think, is a powerful impetus for us to think about the powers of egalitarian traditions in societies and how it's not just about whether a society received a lot of immigrants over the centuries or whether, in fact, the values of the society are imparted to new immigrants and their children such that people do have those opportunities and the society can remain cohesive even as it brings in large numbers of people from the outside.
Bray, let me read this from the website that Richard Wilkinson and his co-author put together, and then I'll get you to comment on it. Michael, here we are, board number 3. The most important obstacle to achieving sustainability is consumerism and the opposition to any policy which appears to be an obstacle to the maximization of personal incomes and consumption. A very important part of what fuels consumption, however, is status competition, keeping up with others, maintaining appearances, having the right clothes, car, housing, education, etc., to compare favorably with others. All these pressures are intensified by greater inequality. Can we have individual freedom without status competition?
Well, we're always going to have some status competition. I mean, we live in open societies. I mean, I guess that's the political challenge we have, and you know, we have it in every country. We have it in, you know, we're not going to affect a revolution in quote consumerism. To me, I have a much more practical objective. I mean, I look at something like, I mean, Sylvia talked about immigration. We say, okay, how do we make sure that when immigrants come to this country, they get quicker access to English language training. They get quicker access to professional recognition of their credentials. How do we do a better job at making sure their kids are getting help in school? How do we make sure that there's programs in school to get them there? How do we deal with the housing issue? I mean, housing is the great orphan of Canadian social and economic policy.
In what respect?
Nobody wants to touch it. It used to be a federal responsibility after the war, and then they downloaded it to the provinces, and then it's down to the cities now, and the cities don't have the money. So, you know, there's some very practical ways in which you say, look, if we're serious as a country about dealing with making sure that people who come to Canada really have an opportunity, and there's lots of data, and Bill, I think Bill will confirm it, lots of data that shows that poverty among recent immigrants is more persistent than it has been, and certainly more persistent than it should be. And these are all examples of where our social and economic thinking and our social practical steps that we need to take has to address the real condition of the people. What is the real condition of the people in Canada today? Is it one to which a positive agenda can respond? I think it can. And you say to me, is it politically sellable? I think it is. But if you say, I'm going to sell it by preaching about consumerism and preaching about people complaining about status, I don't think that's a big winner politically. I'm certainly not going to go down that road. But I do think that if you have a higher level, let's take something simple like crime. Again, you know, our friends on the political right make a point about saying they want to be tough on crime. Well, fact of the matter is that there's a lot of reasons why we have crime in our major cities. There's a lot of issues which produce it, and you know,
would income inequality be one of them?
Income inequality is definitely one of them. The condition of those people is definitely one of them. Condition of the people who are committing crimes is one of those reasons, and throwing people in jail and throwing away the key is not necessarily going to solve the problem. We have to look at the underlying causes. At how do we prevent these things? And I think that the improvement of social provision for people, the improvement of economic opportunity for people, is the best way, as well as practical programs of breaking up gangs and dealing with the causes. These are all things we have to recognize.
Bill Watson, Bob Ray's given you a half a dozen things you can chew on there. Which one do you want to tackle?
Economic opportunity is pretty good. I'll agree with him on that. I mean, I want to get practical too. Dr. Wilkinson said that Canada and the United States should be as equal as Finland. I don't remember the Gini coefficients to be technical, but they're pretty far apart between those countries. He may have them at hand. How do you do that? To my mind, what you do in all likelihood is reduce incomes at the top in the United States by imposing a big tax and redistributing. Maybe redistributing by providing social services, maybe redistributing by just providing cash. You know, nothing helps poverty like cash, at least in the short term. I think that if you tried that in the United States, it'd be a gigantic change. I mean, I think it's quite easy to say, well, let's, reduce the Gini coefficient. To get to that place would require momentous change. Now, the other thing I want to understand is the causality here. I don't think we should be doing major social policy on the basis of correlations. One of the factors that gets better when there's less inequality is obesity. I want to understand, why do people eat less as a result of lower inequality? If I'm poor and all I can afford is starch, I'm going to have health problems. But if there's no change in my income at all, but somebody at the top of the income distribution gets a little richer, I don't see how that affects obesity. I think we got to work these things out in practical terms. Why do I have an incentive to eat more? Does envy make me eat more because of people at the top end? I think if you're doing real-world public policy, you've got to go beyond the correlations and try to figure out what makes people move where they live. And I don't think this does that.
Okay, Richard Wilkinson, I see you champing at the bit to get in. Come on.
Yes. In each chapter of our book, we take a different problem, like violence, like obesity, and go through not only the data, but also the causal pathways. And with obesity, it's quite clear that people eat for comfort when they're depressed or anxious, devalued. There is also a physiological change addressable to early childhood, by which in an insecure world, where you are more stressed, your body is more likely to store food. So you get obesity around the middle rather than lower down, where it's less important for health. What's it called? Insulin resistance seems to be caused by early stress. And that is an effect of inequality and relative poverty on family life. But with something like violence, of course, violence goes up in more unequal countries, not because the poor are attacking the rich, but because people feel more devalued, looked down on. And it is loss of face and things like that, disrespect, that triggers violence most commonly. And with most of the problems we look at, you can see very clearly what the causal pathways are. I mean, with imprisonment, it's not mainly more crime. Part of it's more crime, but the main reason why prison populations go up is because there's more punitive sentencing in more unequal societies. More fear up and down the social hierarchy, or less empathy perhaps, but something quite clearly going with the reduced trust we were talking about earlier, or with the lower involvement in community life, which we also evidence in the book.
Layne Kenworthy, let me ask you about freedom, because that is such a huge part of the American lore. Do you worry that the egalitarian message that is being pitched on this program today chips away at personal freedom, which Americans were led to believe prize so faithfully?
Well, that's certainly the political argument, or the political retort that's usually made. I'm not convinced at all that there's any, in the context of the rich countries that we're talking about here, ranging from Sweden and Denmark on the one hand with very low income inequality, to the United States on the other with the highest among these countries, I think there's virtually no relevant sacrifice of freedom between moving from one to the other. I'd like, if I could, to just say something about the question of the practical matter of reducing income inequality that was raised earlier, because I think it's a really important one. And even if you agree that reducing inequality would have very large beneficial effects, It's not, I think, a simple matter to figure out how one would do that in the context of, say, the United States. I'll just give you a few I don't want to overwhelm your viewers at all with statistics, but I'll just give you one very simple, important empirical point. Among the richest 1% of households in the United States, the average income in 1980, so about 3 decades ago, was around $300,000. Right before the recession, around 2006, 2007, that was up to about $1.2 million, adjusting for inflation. So it had roughly quadrupled in the space of a little less than 3 decades. So if you wanted to get the degree of inequality back to something like pre-1980s levels in the United States, if you thought that maybe that would be a better level for society, fairer or contributing to fewer social ills, you would either have to reduce the incomes of those top 1%, a non-trivial amount, or if you're thinking about quadrupling the incomes of those at the bottom, among the bottom fifth of American households, the average income is about $15,000. So you're talking about boosting that up to $60,000, which I think would be a wonderful thing, but it's not easy to envision exactly how one would do that. So I think even very committed egalitarians need to be cautious about how they think they might be able to achieve a serious reduction in inequality in, say, the U.S. context.
Okay, Sylvie Beshef, you've heard the prescription. Is that possible to do?
Well, I think it's difficult. It's interesting that we're speaking with a colleague based in Tucson. I happened to be in Tucson the day that the U.S. Congress passed the Obama health care bill, and the office of the Democratic member of the U.S. House in Tucson had her office completely trashed through a violent attack that night. So, I mean, there's a sense about
Arizona's a red state?
No. I'm saying that there was a sense that for a Democrat to vote with the president that night was a dangerous act, and so there's a loss of freedom. That's a loss of freedom for people who have an idea about making a better society and feel a chill in terms of their ability to vote in Congress. And I think we have to be honest about the extent to which there is a huge resistance, particularly, as Bob pointed out, among people who are benefiting from this unequal distribution that we've seen. We have seen redistribution, but it's gone in the non-redistributive direction. And I think you're right, it's very hard to undo.
Let me ask Bob Ray the political question then. What's harder to do in politics? Take away from the rich or give to the poor?
Well, I think there are circumstances in which both are difficult. I mean, let's be very direct about it. I think that Layne summarized the challenge. I mean, there is a real challenge, but I do not believe it's impossible to talk to Canadians more about, well, how much suffering, how much inequality are we really prepared to put up with? I mean, Bill talked about, we all face this challenge living in urban centers. We walk by people who are sleeping in the street. How much of that do we think should continue to go on? Do we just think this is okay, that it's perfectly natural to have this level of inequality and vagrancy?
My hunch is no one thinks it's okay, but we have different ideas on how to solve it.
But I don't think we're addressing some of the things. The key to a successful politics is to convince more people that it's good for them. I think the one of the great things about the book is that it points out that the real meaning of solidarity is that in fact everybody benefits, that everybody can benefit from a carefully crafted policy that actually says this is not only good for you, we're not just giving something to somebody, we're not just asking lower middle income people to give up something so really poor people can get something. We're trying to increase opportunity for everybody and frankly increase the level of social benefits that are there for all people. And when you do that, you all benefit. If we had, I think people who live in downtown Toronto, for example, I think they worry about crime. I think they'd like to see policies that increase security that don't involve having a policeman in front of every house. I mean, I think we begin to look at this thing and saying, it's better to live in a higher trust society than a lower trust society. That's a social good that we can see. And so the trick to a successful politics, the key to it, is to reinforce the things that actually benefit everyone and do it in a way that isn't seen as being, you're not confiscating people's livelihoods, and you're not confiscating. I mean, obviously those are political no-nos. And if you don't successfully combine a sense of opportunity and freedom with the increase in equality and a sense of opportunity for people, you don't succeed. And that's, you know, we've in my lifetime, I've experienced ups and downs, so I know that some of these things are easier than others. But
Go ahead,
it's still worth the effort.
Richard, I see you trying to get in again.
Yes, I think that it's important to realize, of course, these problems of inequality are not going to be solved in a year or two. If you read Paul Krugman, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, on the trends in income inequality in the 20th century in the United States, he points out that there was a consistent downward trend from about 1930 right through until sometime in the 1970s of declining inequality. It's only in the later 70s and 80s that we get this rapid rise. If we're going to reverse it, we need first that people have the political will, and that means recognizing the benefits to all of us, recognizing that we don't really improve the quality of our lives anymore by simply going in for the consumerist status competition and so on. How we improve the quality of our lives now is by improving the quality of the social environment, social relations in our society, and recognizing that that is built on the scale of income differences between us. And it will take a long social movement, a long-term social movement committed to those objectives. But it isn't simply through greater taxes and benefits, through redistribution, that you increase equality. It's also by reducing the income differences before taxes and benefits. And an interesting example in the United States, of course, is New Hampshire, which is one of the more equal states with better health and fewer social problems than most others. And yet how it gets its greater equality is by having smaller income differences. It has very low state taxation, very low government social expenditure. But interestingly, its neighbour, Vermont, gets its greater equality through redistribution, taxes and benefits. So there are two quite different ways you can hold down income differences before tax.
Right?
Hang on, so we've got about 3.5 minutes to go here. Bill Watson, what did you want to say on that, very briefly?
Well, I just wanted to say, you know, if we could all be bedroom communities for Boston, then we would all attract large numbers of well-paid professionals. They would all have roughly the same income, and you'd have a good deal of equality. But you know, in the background of this data is a story that has to be told about how people live where they do, what they do for a living, and so on. I just don't think that correlations of the sort proposed work very much.
Okay, Richard, a quick comment on that?
I think that...
Stand by, sorry, we're down to very little time, and I've got one more thing that I'm dying to get on the agenda here, so go, no pun intended.
Well, it looks as if
Richard.
one of the ways that perhaps New Hampshire gets its greater equality is by defending the right of people to join trade unions. It looks as if stronger trade unions are part of more equal societies, but Japan too gets its greater equality, not primarily through redistribution, but by having smaller income differences to start with.
Okay,
and
let me jump in here.
That's not simply that professionals live there rather than some other country.
Understood. Let me jump in here, and I want to do one more thing in the last couple of minutes we got. David Brooks, writing the New York Times, quoted a study which showed the following. It's quite fascinating. 6.7% of Swedes living in America were poor, and 6.7% of Swedes living in Sweden were poor. And he writes, we should all probably calm down about politics. Most of the proposals we argue about so ferociously will have only marginal effects on how we live, especially compared with the ethnic, regional, and social differences that we so studiously ignore. Okay, you know, one politician, one political scientist here on the panel with me here. Time to just chillax a bit about politics, Bob Ray?
No, I don't think so. I mean, David Brooks is a smart Burkean conservative and
progressive conservative.
Well, yes, I would say in that sense, it's always interesting to hear from him. I think the thing that I think we need to realize is that politics has to be about something substantive. Mm-hmm. I think what people are troubled about the political process today is a lot of what passes for politics seems to be very trivial. It doesn't seem to be about things that really matter. And I think what the Wilkinson book does is it reminds us that, first of all, this is a big project. It's not a small project. We're not talking about a little issue here. And he's right, it's a big social movement. I mean, it took, and if I may say so, it also takes leadership. I mean, leadership of a Roosevelt, the circumstantial change that took place after the Depression, which led to tremendous generational commitment for change, and I think those are all big factors. But I think one of the things that political leaders need to think about is how can we talk about things that are really important to people and that actually connect to people. And I think that's something we all need to think about in order to succeed in life.
Sylvia.
I think the book is hugely important because it reminds us that issues like education and literacy are keys to people moving up in a knowledge-based society. And I think it shows us that social cohesion that allows people from different backgrounds to have the opportunity to have a meaningful education and to be literate, which helps employers, which is crucial to economic growth that people care about in a capitalist society, that social cohesion is a win-win social good. And I think that's the importance of the book, and I think those are the issues that we need to talk about in politics.
I suspect, Richard Wilkinson, you're happy to leave it there and let that compliment be the last word on the program today.
Fine.
Can I thank you for joining us from London, UK, and good luck trying to put a government together there. We wish you well. We know how to do minority governments and hung parliaments over here. So if you need some help, call one of our folks over here. We'll tell you how to do it. The name of the book is The Spirit Level, and we thank you, Richard, for joining us from London, UK this evening. Layne Kenworthy, the sociologist from the University of Arizona, thank you for joining us on the line from Tucson. William Watson, the economist, McGill University, thank you for being there from Montreal. Bob Ray, Sylvia Bashevkin here in our Toronto studios.
Nice to be with you always.
Thank you.
Thank you.